Ukraine celebrates as the last of Russia's forces are pushed out of their country. Putin sits at his desk staring into nothingness as the reality of what has happened sinks in. Suddenly, a group of masked men burst through the doors. They enter with their guns raised. The president of Russia screeches in horror as the masked men open fire. Vladimir Putin is no more. The nation he once controlled splinters into different factions as power-hungry regional leaders fight for control. The hypothetical scenario that's about to play out is one of many possibilities. Vladimir Putin is unpredictable, but what happens when he is gone might be even harder to anticipate. Numerous actors have their sights set on becoming the next ruler of Russia, but the fight to control the country might very well lead to its collapse into several different nations. This will lead to the destabilization of the largest country in the world and will lead to death, destruction, and a world that teeters on the edge of oblivion. Putin is no longer the ruler of Russia due to the bullet lodged in his head. Although those who were close to him still have power and control aspects of the military, the presidential envoys of the 8 districts of Russia are now vying for power. They threaten one another with war and economic instability. No one can agree on who should rule the country now that their fearless leader is dead. Threats turn to violence, Russia splinters, and war breaks out along its borders. Each of the 8 districts claims sovereignty and begins establishing their own government. The world sits back and watches as Russia consumes itself in a civil war of a magnitude that has never been seen before. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin was supposed to take over if Putin ever fell from power, but factions inside the Kremlin are afraid he'll be too lenient with Western leaders. They fear the West's encroachment on Russian territory will threaten their very way of life. After Putin's found dead, Mishustin's body is discovered in his car, clearly foul play involved. What was once the Central Federal District is now known as the Central Russian Federation. This new nation is controlled by Igor Shoglev. He had once been the press secretary for Putin and later became the Minister of Communications and Mass Media. When Putin reorganized Russia's districts, Shoglev became envoy to the Central Federal District. Now he claims to rule Moscow and the rest of the territory that was once under his jurisdiction. Shoglev uses the knowledge and skills he developed working as Minister of Communications to launch a massive misinformation campaign against the other newly formed countries to try to bring their citizens back under the control of Moscow. However, the only people that get his message are those in the Central Russian Federation. Shoglev no longer controls the media in the rest of the 8 districts, as they're now ruled by their own governments. Shoglev oversees 251,000 square miles of land and a population of around 38 million. This new nation is part of the European continent and borders Ukraine, meaning Shoglev has a lot to worry about if he hopes to remain in power. There are enemies on all sides, and even though this section of Russia used to have a GDP of 407 billion euros, a lot of that money came from businesses and real estate that no longer exists due to the divide in the nation. Almost 90% of the population in the Central Russian Federation identifies as Russian, so there is cohesion among the populace. A large part of Russia's military is already stationed in this region due to the war in Ukraine, so Shoglev has access to a large number of weapons and war vehicles. Shoglev's goal is to try to convince the other nations around him to join together to create a unified front and pull the country back together. However, this doesn't seem likely to happen, as the rulers from those countries have already begun fortifying their borders and claim sovereignty from Moscow. The Central Russian Federation struggles to support itself without unfettered access to the vast resources of the rest of what used to be Russia, and constant pressure from the West knocking on its door has the government in the country very worried. To the north sits the Northwestern Russian Federation that developed from the former Northwestern Federal District. The new capital of this nation is St. Petersburg, and at 651,000 square miles, it's much larger than the land that Shoglev controls. From a fortified building in St. Petersburg, the new president, Alexander Gutsin, rules with an iron fist. He has 13.6 million subjects within his borders, and as a former member of the Russian Security Council, he has a unique understanding of the military assets that sit within his borders. Gutsin leverages his position along the Baltic Sea to move goods in and out of his new nation. Although unthinkable during the time of Putin, Gutsin has tried to make amends with the Finnish government. He knows that Finland has been growing its military, and now that Russia has fractured, he cannot fight a war on multiple fronts. Instead, he tries to convince Finland and the rest of Europe that his new Northwestern Russian Federation can become an ally. Perhaps, given enough time, his new country could eventually join the European Union. Gutsin doesn't want this to happen for totally unselfish reasons. Instead, he hopes that by allying himself with Finland and the rest of the EU, he can protect his new country from being attacked by the other nations that have emerged from the dissolution of Russia. The Northwest Federal District once made up 10% of Russia's GDP, generating close to 129 billion euros annually. The industrial output of the region is enormous, and its agriculture sector can sustain the population within the new country country's borders. In fact, the crops are so plentiful that Gutzon begins making trade deals with the rest of Europe in hope that it'll strengthen his new nation's bond with the West. Although 3 other emerging countries surround the northwestern Russian Federation, they all lie to the south. This allows Gutzon's military to focus its defensive efforts along one border. Like all of the new nations that splintered away from Moscow after Putin was killed, the northwestern Russian Federation must ensure it keeps a close eye on its neighbors. This new country has a lot of economic power that other rulers might desire, but for the time being, Gutzon's nation is in a good position. The Southern Russian Federation, formerly known as the Southern Federal District, is less fortunate. When Putin was in power, Crimea was placed under the district's governance. However, now that Ukraine has taken back its land, the Southern Russian Federation has lost one of its most valuable trade hubs. To make matters worse, Ukraine has not forgiven the egregious actions of the Russian invasion and holds the Southern Russian Federation personally accountable for many of the atrocities that happened during the fight to reclaim Crimea. Vladimir Vasilievich Ustinov is in control of this new nation, as he desperately tries to fortify the border between his country and Ukraine. The Ukrainian military has no plans to invade as they rebuild their nation from the ravages of war, but in the future, the Southern Russian Federation might not be so lucky. The one thing that Ustinov has going for him is that when Russia broke apart, his nation was able to maintain control of the Black Sea Fleet. This gives him the authority over the Black Sea waterways in the region. Ustinov rules the Southern Russian Federation from Rostov-on-Don, which sits across the Sea of Azov from Crimea. Its location is a constant reminder of the danger that the Southern Russian Federation faces in the future. However, having access to the Black Sea allows trade to remain strong in the nation. Like in the Northwestern Russian Federation, Ustinov tries desperately to make amends with Europe. There's no way his new country will survive if it isn't granted some protection from its neighbors, including Ukraine. Ustinov was formerly Russia's Minister of Justice, and although not much justice was done under his watch, he has a firm grasp of international laws. He uses this experience to appeal to different bodies within the United Nations to ask for aid. Ustinov also tries to create closer ties between his nation and Kazakhstan. But Prime Minister Alihan Smylov refuses to ally his country with any of the new nations due to the backlash that might occur from other powers in the region. Therefore, Ustinov has to rely on the 13.8 million people within the 162,000 square mile borders of the Southern Russian Federation. He leverages the coal and oil reserves on the shelf of the Caspian Sea to help fuel the building of a new nation. Mineral waters are procured and shipped across the Black Sea, where they're sold on the international market. Altogether, the Southern Federation of Russia has a GDP of around 81 billion euros, which is not bad considering its smaller size. And like some of its neighbors, the Southern Russian Federation can produce enough food on its lands and harvest enough marine resources from the surrounding waters to support its population. The only thing keeping this new nation from thriving is the constant threat of war all around it. The smallest nation to emerge from the breaking up of Russia is the North Caucasian Russian Federation, or NCRF. Before separating from the motherland, it was known as the North Caucasian Federal District. Its administrative headquarters is located in Pyatigorsk, which sits in the southern reaches of the nation. At 65,800 square miles and a population of just less than 10 million, the NCRF is not the most powerful nation to come out of the dissolution of Russia. Yuri Chaika is the leader of this new country, and as a previous prosecutor general of Russia, he immediately declares martial law. He does this because only around 30% of his citizens identify as Russian. There are several ethnic minorities throughout the region who have voiced their desire to have a state of their own. Almost 15% of the population identifies as Chechens, while another 9 are Avars. The two ethnicities alone consist of almost as many people as those who identify as Russian. Chaika knows he needs help, otherwise what happened to Russia as a whole will happen to the NCRF. He reaches out to President Saloma Zurabishvili of Georgia for help. She responds by telling him that Georgia will only aid the NCRF if martial law is lifted and talks begin to ensure people of all ethnicities have equal rights in the new country. Chaika refuses to loosen his stranglehold on the population and continues to do business as usual. But his nation will not be able to last if things do not change. His people are slowly tearing apart what he's created. It'll only be a matter of time before revolutions pop up across the NCRF. Any foreign nation that wants to claim its land only needs to wait until civil war breaks out within the NCRF and then roll in after the opposing forces weaken each other. As the other new countries that emerged from the breakup of Russia strengthen their positions, the NCRF becomes weaker. The people in the region have been oppressed for too long, and they will reclaim their homelands from Yuri Chaika. The Volga Russian Federation, also known just as Volga, is the country with the second largest population after the Central Russian Federation. Approximately 30 million people live within its 400,000 square miles of territory. The capital of this new country is Nizhny Novgorod. which sits in the middle of its territory. Due to road and railway connections, there is relatively easy access between Moscow and the Volga Russian Federation capital. Talks have happened between the current ruler of Volga, Igor Komarov, and Igor Shogalev of the Central Russian Federation. These two leaders know that if they can put aside their differences and band together, they could unify all of the Russian territories once again. They would need to take each one by force, but they would have the manpower and resources to do so if they could just work together. However, this is easier said than done. Komarov was an industrialist before becoming the head of the United Rocket and Space Corporation and then Director General of the State Corporation for Space Activities. He has big ambitions and access to some of the best scientists, engineers, and pilots in what was formerly Russia. Komarov knows that the Volga-Russia Federation is one of the strongest new nations, if not the strongest, to come out of the breakup of Russia. There is a large number of manufacturing facilities in this new nation, and Komarov controls most of the railways that connect Southeast Asia and Europe. Although the Volga-Russian Federation doesn't have the largest GDP, it's close at around 133 billion euros a year. It's protected from any aggression by Europe due to its location on the east of the Central Russian Federation and the Southern Russian Federation. Komarov also has tried to convince Kazakhstan to ally itself with him. He cites the shared history of space exploration between former Russia and Kazakhstan. The Baikonur Cosmodrome still exists within Kazakhstan's borders, and Komarov promises funds and a joint space program if Kazakhstan becomes an ally. Together, they can attack any enemy from the skies and advance the power of both countries. This gives the leaders of Kazakhstan pause. Talks of joint operations commence. Komarov has access to many of the satellites Russia put into space during his time as Director General, and he plans to use them to spy on his enemies. He also has plans to establish a new space habitat solely for Volga astronauts to conduct experiments and claim space for the glory of his country. These are grand plans and will consume large amounts of resources, but if all goes according to plan, Komarov may gain leverage over the other nations around him. He has access to state-of-the-art missiles and large stores of Soviet-era tanks, and if he can convince another nation to join him, their alliance could be unstoppable. Komarov's dreams are a possibility due to the fact that over 80% of Russia's former car industry lies within its borders. More importantly, the Volga-Russian Federation contains facilities that created around 60% of Russian aircraft and 30% of its military vehicles and weapons. The industrial capacity of the new country is unparalleled by anyone else. This is why Komarov is not afraid to make threats against the Central Russian Federation or anyone else around Volga. The Volga-Russian Federation is a power to be reckoned with, and if it can secure an alliance with Kazakhstan, it'll only be a matter of time before it comes after the other nations. However, there is one territory that might be able to strangle the life out of Volga. This nation is the Ural-Russian Federation. This new country is larger than all the territories to its west, but what makes the Ural-Russian Federation so powerful is its oil and natural gas supplies. This nation not only has large stores of fossil fuels, but goods and energy resources must pass through the Ural-Russian Federation before reaching territories to its west. The Ural-Russian Federation is ruled by Vladimir Vladimirovich Yakushev. He was previously the Minister of Construction, Housing, and Utilities, so he knows how to build up the infrastructure of his new nation. With a GDP of 141 billion euros, it has the second largest economy of the new nations after the Central Russian Federation. However, Yakushev is not so worried about this, as the countries to the west will crumble without the natural resources that he controls. Yakushev controls a population of around 12 million and 702,100 square miles of land. He rules from Yekaterinburg, in the heart of the country. Before Russia was broken up, the Ural region provided the country with around 90% of its natural gas and 68% of its oil. This means that no matter how strong the other militaries are or what technology they have, the Ural-Russian Federation holds the key to fueling practically every country in the region, and this is why Yakushev isn't afraid of the Volga-Russian Federation or any other nation to its west. Yakushev uses the immense wealth and resources of his new country to form powerful allies. Even though China initially vowed to stay out of the affairs of Russia as it splintered into 8 new nations, they're developing increasingly close ties to the Ural-Russian Federation. Oil and natural gas are powerful motivators during negotiations, and Vladimir Vladimirovich Yakushev is not afraid to remind other leaders of the leverage he has. In exchange for the natural resources, China gives the Ural-Russian Federation weapons and vehicles. Yakushev's nation is becoming more and more powerful with each day that passes. To the east of the Ural-Russian Federation sits the Siberian Russian Federation. This new country dwarfs all territories to its west. Its land spans 1,684,100 square miles, with a population of just over 17 million. Anatoly Cheryshev rules this nation through fear, using a spy network he created based on his time in the KGB. Novosibirsk is the capital of the Siberian Russian Federation. It's in the middle of the Asian continent along the Ob River. Seryshev knows that even though he has more land than most countries in the region, he will need allies if he's to compete with nations such as Volga or the Ural-Russian Federation. He looks to Mongolia for an alliance. Seryshev hopes by creating close ties with countries to his south, he will only need to focus on protecting his western and eastern borders. The leaders of Mongolia are hesitant to form any alliance without consulting China first. And since the Chinese seem to be forging a pact with the Ural-Russian Federation, Seryshev might be out of luck. The Siberian Russian Federation produces large quantities of bituminous coal, which they use to power their cities and towns. It's a dirty form of energy that pollutes the air around major cities. Manufacturing centers become covered in soot, reminiscent of the Industrial Revolution days of Britain. The nation also produces a large quantity of aluminum, which is traded to surrounding governments for funds to procure food. The lands of Siberia are not fertile, and the citizens of the Siberian Russian Federation are in constant need of sustenance. If Seryshev can't come to an agreement with one of his neighbors to secure more goods for his people, he may have a rebellion on his hands. The Far East Russian Federation is the largest of all the nations that were born from the demise of Putin's Russia. However, it's also the least populated. Its land spans 2,684,400 square miles and contain around 8 million people. This gives the nation a population density of 3.1 people per square mile. This is almost 3 times less than the Siberian Federation of Russia and 50 times less dense than the Central Russian Federation. What this means is that the Far East Russian Federation has a lot of empty land, which is controlled by Yuri Trutnev. Trutnev served as the Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment of Russia before seizing control of the region when Russia broke apart. What is unique about this new country is the focus on environmentalism. Trutnev is still an authoritarian ruler who rules from Vladivostok, but he has focused much of his attention on protecting the unique ecosystems within its borders. In 2008 and 2009, Trutnev was Russia's highest-earning member in the government. During this time, he made approximately 155 million rubles, or about $5.34 million. He's used his wealth to secure power in the Far Eastern Russian Federation, but also to aid in conservation efforts. The new nation's GDP is only around 73 billion euros, most of which comes from building machinery and controlling a large part of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The nation's people also contribute to the economy through lumber sales, fishing, hunting, and fur trapping. The Far Eastern Russian Federation takes an isolationist position in the region. It has access to the Pacific, which allows for maritime trading during parts of the year when the waters around its ports are unfrozen. But Trutnev and the other people of the region have almost all the resources they need within their borders. The environment provides for the people, but only because there are so few of them. The Far Eastern Russian Federation has vowed to remain out of any conflicts that should arise in the region. Since they're so far removed from most of the power-hungry dictators that have taken control of the new countries that arose after the breakup of Russia, the Far Eastern Russian Federation's neutrality should not be taken as a guarantee. The nation does not have a big military or any way to ramp up wartime production, so if they ever were invaded, it would be a very quick war that Trutnev would not win. When Vladimir Putin died and Russia was broken up into 8 different nations, the world watched to see what would happen next. Some of these new countries were more aggressive than others, and over time, armies clashed. Many of the people in power wanted to reunify Russia, but only if they could be the ruler of it all. Revolutions erupted in nations that had ethnic minorities vying for independence. Other countries were at the mercy of the Russian people, who were fed up with being ruled by tyrants. And as each nation either thrived or was consumed in war, the world watched in horror at what happened next. When Russia dissolved into different countries, its nuclear arsenal was split between the different leaders. All of the new nations had access to nuclear missiles. As the closely packed countries in the west of what was formerly Russia clashed with one another, the big guns came out. However, this time the nukes weren't being directed at the United States, Europe, or NATO. They were pointed at each other. The 8 Russian countries launched nukes at one another, either as a way to decimate enemy forces, take out the opposition, or defend their own borders. The war between the 8 nations that were born from the dissolution of Russia ended in a nuclear holocaust. It's going to take years before the land will be free of radiation, at which point a new nation will arise from the ashes. Now watch why Poland is preparing for full-scale war against Russia, or check out the one change to Russia Putin couldn't predict: war in Ukraine.